Okay, thank you so much for coming out and joining us this evening. My name is Dan Olson. I'm the superintendent for the Monona Grove School District. And what we would like to try to accomplish tonight is to provide a lot of background information, where we're at in the process in our facilities planning, what our preliminary recommendations are, and then certainly where our next steps are moving forward. So primarily it's an opportunity to update community members on the process. There will be an opportunity as well for us to get feedback from those of you that are here tonight. We'll have some Q&A at the end. We'll also have an opportunity to have breakout discussions to go in a little bit more in-depth dialogue for questions that you might have, and we'll have a community feedback form for you to fill out as well that will help us guide us in our next steps in our process. Okay, so specifically, again, we're talking about the background. We want to talk about the needs. Again, I want to emphasize, this is not anywhere close to being a final recommendation. It's where we're at so far in the process and some preliminary findings and recommendations, but there'll be a lot of opportunity for feedback that will help our committee as well as our board in their decision-making over the next 6 months, really. So, this diagram shows really the timeline of what has happened since the last major project in the school district. So in 2008, Glacial Drumlin School opened, and since that time, we've had a number of things happen that bring us up to the point tonight in our next step of facilities planning. So back in 2014, we realized we're starting to have some enrollment. We saw a steady increase in enrollment for a number of years. The district for many years, or for about a 10-year period, had some decline in enrollment and then stable, and then we started to see the increase. So in 2014, we had an enrollment study done to look at those trends and an initial projection of looking at 20 years out of what might happen. And then following that in 2015, we did a preliminary facility study. We put together a group called Long Range Facilities Planning, where they really did an assessment of our existing buildings, looked at that preliminary enrollment study, and made some preliminary recommendations for further study moving forward. Then in 2016, we had a little bit of a pause from our facilities planning because we had a need for the operational referendum, which really was about our base budget and the funding that we had at that time from the state and our revenue limits. And so we spent a year really focusing on that operational referendum. And then this past year, we picked up again with the facilities planning. So in that process, the Board of Education then this past year created a long-range facilities planning committee. And that planning committee really, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Back to the 2015 planning committee came away with really 3 key recommendations for further study. Okay, so the first was that they put together that facilities assessment and the recommendation to the board to accept that study as a basis of our future planning. Okay, secondly, the more specific information as far as the guidelines in order to proceed to the next phase. Talked about one of the key things is looking at grade configuration. Any future building work, whether it be additions or new schools, that there need to be some consideration of grade configurations in those schools, because we've had a number of variations in all the schools over the years, and that's kind of a key point moving forward to come up with something that was more sustainable. Certainly maximizing the existing space before we look at any new construction of any sort. Developing the capital maintenance plan. You'll see that we have quite a bit of deferred maintenance, and that needs to be carefully considered in any future planning. We looked at real estate. We have a number of properties that are owned by the district that currently are not being utilized. And so the recommendation, put a plan in place. What are we going to do with those facilities? Can we use that property for future planning, or should we look at selling some or maintaining, for possible future use, again, in the future? And then lastly, of course, we looked at some of our athletic facilities. We'll go into a little bit of specific or detail on that tonight, but we actually own very few of our own athletic facilities. We have great partnerships with the Village of Cottage Grove and the City of Monona, but there are some challenges when we don't have district-owned facilities. So those are all things that the committee did some preliminary study on, and the recommendation is we need to study further and come up with some firm plans in each of those areas. Okay, and so then the final recommendation to the Board of Education was move on and proceed with a phase 2 in planning, work with hire an architectural firm and construction management to help facilitate that process, and really to follow through on those recommendations and come up with a firm plan. So that then the intention was to move on to 2016 and continue that work. As I mentioned, we had a little bit of a pause when we found the need to go to operational referendum. Okay, I'll spend just a quick minute on reviewing what that operational referendum is about and how is that different than a facilities referendum or debt. And the big difference is operating is simply to take care of your day-to-day budget. So it's asking for authority to exceed revenue limits that we have in place for our annual budget. So that amount can be spent on a number of different areas, but it can be is in the general operating budget. Where a facilities budget, a facilities referendum is typically to issue debt, to do major construction, to add new buildings or additions where you're borrowing typically for a 20-year period and then to pay off over that time. So two very different types of referendums. And again, I won't go through each of these bullet points. You can see those, but those are the key areas that we ask the community to support in our operational. So that $2.6 million, that was simply to increase our operating budget every year by 2.6, not cumulative, but just a one-time 2.6 and then maintain that annually. So spread across all the different areas that we have in our operating budget, you know, curriculum, technology, personnel, equipment, and there was some that went towards facilities, about $500,000 increase in our capital maintenance budget. But to keep in mind, our overall operating budget is about $40 million. $500,000 doesn't get you very far when it talks about roof replacements, parking lots, you know, that sort of thing. So it's certainly badly needed and it helped maintain some of those things, but you'll see in a little bit that we have some other, you know, really important capital needs. Okay, this graph is a little bit more difficult to read, but it's another timeline just really from this past year, from October of 2017 moving forward. And the key point that I would put, you know, on top, the school board's role in this. They appointed a facilities advisory committee to study this work. We're now in that February, March, where we're going to be looking for the community feedback. We'll talk about how we're going to formally survey as well as informally get feedback in this process. The second part down in that is the Facilities Advisory Committee that was formed. And again, they did their work from October up until now, and we're reporting out on the work they've done at this point. And they'll reconvene again back in May once we've had feedback from the community and survey to put together some final recommendations, you know, for the board to consider. And then the last piece just talks about our staff and community communication along the way. So the end result, we're expecting our Board of Education to finalize a plan by August, whatever that plan might be. But we're still only now, you know, towards the beginning of March. August is the timeline for them to gather all this information, get feedback before they put together a final plan on what to do. And we'll talk a little bit tonight about what those plans might look like. Actually, we'll talk a lot about it. That's what we're here for. Okay, so the Facilities Advisory Committee, the board back in August appointed community group with the charge of those 5 key responsibilities. Look at this background information, you know, analyze the options, cost and tax impact, and we're really on step 4 right now to prepare that preliminary recommendation in advance of getting a community survey. So it's really a lot of information that we're sharing out, and then after we get that, we'll come back with that final advisory report to the board in May. Okay, our advisory committee, as I mentioned, was made up of 20 community members. We were thoughtful to make sure that we had representation from both Monona and Cottage Grove communities, as well as to have you know, as much of a cross-section to represent our communities as much as possible. Some parents, non-parents, former parents, and we really tried, and I think, you know, the board did a great job of putting this group together to really have a lot of different viewpoints heard as we you know, did this work. And we're going to have an opportunity, or you're going to have an opportunity to hear from 2 of our committee members this evening to present their findings to you. I'm just going to provide the background information. I'll turn it over to our community committee members to talk more about the work that they did. And I guess what I would like to do before I move any further, we have a number of our committee members here in attendance tonight, and so I would like to recognize them briefly before we move on. So if all of our Facilities Advisory Committee members, would you please stand? So. And I believe we also have a couple board members with us tonight. If our Board of Education members would also stand, please. Okay. Okay. And so all of our committee members do have name tags on, so at the end when we have Q&A and an opportunity for dialogue, please seek them out as well if you have additional questions or dialogue that you'd like to have with those members here this evening. Okay, also in this work, we did have help from 4 different consulting firms in providing background information and information that was critical in putting this work together. So we have representatives tonight, they're with us as well. Epstein Ewan Architects did a lot of work with regarding to, again, our facilities study. They're really the key group that organized that. Findorf was our construction management firm and did a lot with our cost estimating, and again worked hand in hand with EUA in that process. PMA Financial Network has done some preliminary work for us with costing and potential tax impact depending on what kind of project that we might have in the future. And Vanderwall and Associates did our work for our enrollment study, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically later about how important that was in the work that we've done. And so we have, again, representatives from each of those groups that are with us here at the table, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from them as well this evening. Okay, so the work of the committee. Over this last 4 months, they've met a total of 7 times. And they reviewed, and they mentioned all the background information, and I've kind of spoken to the work that they've done, and they have prepared in their preliminary report in writing, which they presented to the school board earlier this month on February 14th. And again, the next step is now to present it out to the community, the work that they've done. Okay, so I'm going to give a summary of the facility's needs, again, before I turn it over to our committee members to talk about what they did in that assessment of those needs. So really, one of the key drivers to this work is our enrollment. We have seen a steady increase in enrollment. This graph shows actual enrollment data back to 2007 to current 17-18. And so you see that over that time, we've added about 525 students to the district over approximately a 10-year period. The projection is we're going to continue to see a similar type of growth in the district, and this shows over the next 10 years. So we're really anticipating an estimate of approximately another 700 students over these next 10 years. So clearly that's creating a need to do something with additional capacity. Now, one of the key questions that the committee really looked at, and it's important for the community to understand as well, is where does open enrollment figure in with this? Open enrollment, of course, is the state law that's been around now for, I think, at least 15 years, maybe going on 20, that allows families to apply and enroll their children in neighboring school districts, so they don't have to be residents of the actual school district. And we do have a fairly large number of open enrollment students in the district, and so the question obvious is, well, if we have open enrollment students and we have capacity issues, why don't we just cut that off? And very legitimate question. So without going into an hour-long presentation about open enrollment, I'll try to explain really briefly here in a couple minutes about why it's not possible to completely cut that off and the work that the Board of Education has done to control those numbers and what they can do in the future. So state law essentially says that school districts must accept open enrollment applications except for a couple exceptions, and one is space. So you may deny open enrollment if you do not have capacity. But you've got to be able to justify that in a systematic way about whether you have space or not. And so, for example, here at Cottage Grove School, 2nd grade, we have, by board policy, our optimal class size I believe is at 22 for second grade. Is it 23? I should know that off the top of my head. But let's use, I believe it's 22. That we have a policy by grade for every level going up through high school. And so the board has to establish that number. So if we say our optimal class size is 22, and we actually only have 20 students per section at that grade level, we have space for 2 students. We have to take those 2 students per section. Now, we are allowed to reserve space for families that may move into the district over the summer and so on. And we do that, and we really try to pick a conservative number to make sure we have as high a number for reserving that space so we don't go over that optimal size. But we have to be able to justify that number. To DPI, should we have, and we do get appeals every year when we turn away students. And so typically, in K through 5, it'll be single digits per grade that we open up seats for, a couple per class, if any. And there are a number of grades that we do have 0, where we're already at that optimal number. So that doesn't create a lot of new students coming in. We can also deny applications if the overall capacity of the building has already been reached. And that's the case at Glacial Drumlin School. Since the overall capacity is there, we don't have to look at individual sections. So we have not taken open enrollment at Glacial Drumlin for many years. So the majority of our open enrollment actually has occurred at the high school, where we do have space. And so 9th grade applications, we typically have accepted all or most of those over the years, and that's where most of our open enrollment students have been. Now, one of the other provisions of the law is you don't have to add sections or hire teachers in order to accommodate open enrollment. And so the last 2 years, we actually haven't taken any at the high school either, because in order to do so, it would mean that we would have to hire more staff to accommodate, even though we might have space. And even though the open enrollment revenue we get more than pays for itself as far as the cost of teachers, we also understand we have these growing space issues, and we want to really manage that size at the high school as well. So I think our board has done a tremendous job. They spent a lot of time analyzing those numbers and managing our open enrollment over the years, and we can, as we move forward, have some tools to manage that as these schools reach closer to capacity to even limit it further. So just to be clear, right now we have about 377 non-resident students attending. The majority of those are at the high school, and that number I would expect to decrease over the next couple of years as we continue to see the resident enrollment increase. Okay, this graph, you certainly cannot see the numbers on it, but hopefully you can identify the different colors. And what that chart shows is our 5 schools. So the first color bar across is Taylor Prairie School. The second one down is Cottage Grove School. Next comes Winnequa. Then 4th is Glacial Drumlin, and high school at the bottom. And what those colors show year by year, from the first column at 2017-18 to the last column 20 years out, 36-37, green shows the projection of being under our capacity. When you get to red, it shows being at or over capacity. So what this chart shows is that Taylor Prairie is expected to be over capacity in 2019-20, Cottage Grove School in 21-22, Winnequa will stay under capacity for the next 20 years according to our projections. Glacial Drumlin School is already over capacity, and the high school, according to this, will reach capacity in 2021. However, there's an asterisk next to that. We can actually control the high school. This was based upon if we continued to take those open enrollment students, which we won't. It also includes MG21 students, which actually are in a different building. So even though this projection would be accurate if we continued, we can control that very easily. And we'll talk about that. We'll have an issue maybe about 10 years from now, but not an immediate issue. All right, so this chart shows what I just described a little bit more clearly. This shows just over the next 5 years from now, where you'll see focusing in the next 5 years, we'll see that 3 of our schools will be at or over capacity: Glacial Drumlin, Taylor Prairie, and Cottage Grove. And I mentioned the high school it shows, but we can limit that by managing open enrollment, so we won't reach capacity at that school. And that's what's really driving not only our long-term planning, but we're going to have a serious discussion about the timing of what this planning. That's something the committee hasn't discussed at this point, but that will be coming up here really quickly to determine and when we do something about the enrollment. Okay, this next chart shows our capital maintenance needs. So this chart indicates that we have right now, $16.4 million in immediate capital maintenance needs, where Winnequa School by far is the highest need at just under $8 million. These are infrastructure type things, okay? HVAC, plumbing, it might include roofs, windows, those sorts of things that have been deferred in some cases over the years. In some cases, just buildings getting older, and we're in those needs of some of those upgrades. When we did the facility study back in 2015, at that time, the estimate was about $14 million of capital maintenance needs. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about why that number went up, but really it's just inflation. 2 years later, additional needs, costs go up, now we're at about $16 million. Renovations. Now, what do we mean by renovations? Believe it or not, we took a long time talking about what do we call this? Do we call it remodeling, updates, renovations? And it's really kind of all of the above. And if, for example, if you think about a home that might have been built in the 60s, okay, there's times that you need to do the maintenance of a new roof and so on. That's capital maintenance. That was the previous slide. But then you might also want to do an update to your kitchen, bathrooms and so on. That's what we mean by the renovations, where they're not critical needs that have to be done structurally, but educationally, we do need some updates in some of our spaces. And so we've identified a number of areas as well where we would like to be able to update some classrooms. In some cases, creating a little bit more flexible spaces for different learning opportunities. And in some cases, expansions. For example, our cafeteria at Glacial Drumlin. We have a capacity issue. We have to run 4 lunch periods to get all the kids through. And so first kids are eating lunch as early as 10:30 in the morning. Last group comes through, I believe, a little bit after 1 o'clock. And so that's a real challenge. Now, part of it is because we're a little bit over capacity as well. But there are some areas like that we really could use a little bit more capacity. Here in Cottage Grove School as well, we have a similar issue with the size of the cafeteria. Okay, this chart just shows at a real high level what some of those needs are in each of the buildings. And so we'll certainly get into, not tonight, won't get to all that specific detail, but just to give you a kind of an overview that at Winnequa School, some of those spaces that we've identified, now some of these are major projects, some are very minor, but areas that ideally we would like to be able to update. And you see there is something at each of the schools that can be done, again, not as not as costly as others. Okay, and then the last piece, the athletics. And you might look at, well, why is that really listed as a need? Is that more of a want? And that's something that we'll determine where the priority comes in. But there are some real challenges. It is an integral part of our educational programming, our high school and middle school, extra and co-curriculars. So we do right now have some serious needs at our existing sites. At the high school, we have 3 facilities or outdoor facilities located at that site. We have outdoor tennis courts that are disrepair, that are not usable for varsity competition. We use it for JV and Phi Ed, but there would be a need to upgrade those. The high school track soon is going to be needs to be upgraded. We resurf it over several years. We're now to the point though that the base needs to be redone, and so that's quite expensive to do that. And then the outdoor facilities as far as the football/soccer field, as well as the practice areas, we have some drainage issues. Ideally, we would like to be able to do some upgrades to that area, concessions, bleachers and so on. But everything that would is on the list as a possible need that we'll have to evaluate, prioritize here moving ahead. Then the other real issue that we have is those are the only 3 facilities that we have. All the other outdoor activities, again, we use village or city sites, softball, baseball, soccer, we use tennis. And in some of those cases, it works fine, but we do have some issues with sometimes with transportation, supervision, and equitable sites as far as between boys' sports and girls' sports, and equity and compared to our other schools that we compete against as well. So again, we've identified all the things that we would like to have to make us comparable to other schools and equitable amongst our sports. We'll go through the prioritization here in the next steps about which of those we really think are most important. Okay, so that's the background information. That's the information that our committee studied over many meetings, looked at in detail, and then they spent time, okay, now what are we going to do about it? And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Patty Parrott to talk a little bit about the options.
Thank you. And just a brief introduction for those of you that I don't know. My name is Patty Parrott. I am a Cottage Grove resident. I've lived here about 8 years in the district, and I have a third grader that goes right here to Cottage Grove School, and I also have a sixth grader over at Glacial Drumlin. So that's my background. Before we can talk about some of the recommendations that we're looking at, for us to understand what our current configuration is for our students. And so that's what this graph that you're looking at, to me at first looked a little bit like a football play. It is not. It is the flow of our students from school to school. So as a point of reference, if you can see the color, the dark color there represents the Cottage Grove students, so the students from this community. The pale blue color represents the movement of the students from the Monona community. So as you can see, for those of you that aren't familiar with how our students flow through the schools here in Cottage Grove, we have 4K through first grade in Taylor Prairie, a couple blocks away. From there, they move into this school, Cottage Grove School, for second to fourth grade. At that point, our fifth graders go over to the middle school at Glacial Drumlin. Now, this is a little bit different, and you can see on the number up there that it's different for Cottage Grove versus Monona students. Cottage Grove students attend Glacial Drumlin 5 through 8. Monona residents attend 6 through 8. And then from there, they obviously both flow into the high school or MG21. Now, if you're a Monona student, you stay in Winnequa for your entire elementary education, 4K all the way through 5th grade, and join our Cottage Grove students in the 6th grade. So that's where we currently stand today. Now, as we took a look at the options that we considered, we obviously considered all of the needs that we've walked through in terms of capacity needs being really important, obviously maintenance needs, as well as some of the athletics wants. And so that process, we explored 7 different opportunities or 7 different ways. There's many different ways to solve a problem, right? But there are some similarities that each one of our options that we explored had. The first one is that we always placed the 5th graders in an elementary school setting. So going back to that last football play chart I showed you, we're taking the 5th grade Cottage Grove students out of Glacial Drumlin School. We're doing this for 2 reasons. One, from the information that we reviewed, it shows that students in the 5th grade perform at a higher level if they're kept in an elementary setting as long as possible. And 2, we wanted to get greater alignment with what the Monona students were doing as well. The second thing that we, all of our options considered was construction of a new elementary school. As we looked at those capacity numbers that were shared with us in the chart, it became clear to us that there was no way to keep our students in Cottage Grove unless we give them another building, another place to go. We did include in our preliminary recommendations renovation for the school sites, that chart that was shared with you earlier. We did include recommendations for updating athletics facilities, and we did recommend that we fund the full $16.4 million in capital maintenance needs. Now, Dan stated this earlier, and I want to reiterate this. The recommendations that we're sharing with you tonight are very, very preliminary. They represent our total wish list. It's through sessions like this, community engagement sessions, as well as a survey where we're going to help prioritize what's important to the community and then come back with that recommendation later on in the process. Now, there were some differences in the different opportunities. Obviously, we came up with 7 different ones. So there had to be some things that were different. The committee talked extensively about where to put the school, or not where physically to put it, but who to put in it. So is it something that you treat like a neighborhood school model, where perhaps there's a Cottage Grove school on this side of town and a new school on a different side of town, and we split based on residential boundaries? Or is it one where we transition our students through and give them another transition point, like you saw in the football diagram earlier? So I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. We did talk a lot about grade configurations and which grades to put in the new school versus existing schools, and which grades to keep in which buildings. And then we did talk a lot about the utilization of Maywood School. For those of you that might be newer to the district, you might not know, Maywood is a building in the Monona community that's currently rented out to the Madison School District. So with that, I will get into our summary of our preliminary recommendation. So what did we address? Obviously, we addressed the capacity issue, really focusing on that 4K to 8, because that's what we saw in the next 5 to 8 years. We're going to have serious problems with capacity of our elementary school students. So we have not addressed the high school at this time. Again, the maintenance, I hit on this earlier. We do feel it's very important to act on the maintenance needs now, and Joe is going to get into that a little bit later on as well. At this point in time, we did include the renovations that were recommended, that dot chart that was shared with you. And again, we can go into more detail about that. But things to update classrooms, address shared spaces, particularly cafeterias and libraries. A lot of talk last week about glacial drumlin. So we talked about obviously not only increasing the cafeteria space there, but also some phy-ed space, as well as providing room for additional pods, as well as taking a look at some of that space that's very underutilized at glacial drumlin because it's just not constructed in a way that makes sense. And finally, we did include athletics in there as well. So we do have a primary recommendation to share with you, which I'll get into next. And then we have one slight spin off of that, which was not the committee's primary recommendation, but something that we did want to pass along to get community feedback on, as well as to leave it to the board to make the ultimate decision. So as I hinted at, our primary recommendation does include the construction of a new elementary school, and that's the red school listed here. After much discussion about those items that I talked about before, our primary recommendation is that we keep 4K and K students in Cottage Grove at Taylor Prairie School. From there, they move over here to Cottage Grove School for first and second. From there, they make an additional transition to the new school, which would be grades 3 through 5, effectively bringing the 5th graders out of glacial drumlin. And then in 6th grade, they'll join their Monona counterparts in glacial drumlin, making glacial drumlin a true middle school. So a couple of benefits that the committee felt why this was our best possible option. Obviously, it keeps all of our Cottage Grove students together. We did not want to entertain anything that included sending our Cottage Grove students to Monona or splitting them up more than they needed to be. We talked a lot about, I mentioned that idea between a transition school model versus a neighborhood school model. And the committee felt that adding one additional transition was better for our students than trying to divide them into a neighborhood concept. The primary reason that we kept coming back to on that really has to do with equity. So, you know, we've got a plot of land. I'll talk a little bit about where it is for those of you that don't know. But it becomes a very difficult task to draw those attendance boundaries about who gets to go to this school and who gets to go to that school. Beyond that, it separates your teaching staff. So we did hear a lot from our administrators and some of our teachers about how they're able, when they're in the same facility, to mentor each other, share ideas, and grow and collaborate that way. If we're splitting them up, we're really taking that opportunity away from our educators. We also talked with the administrators and the teachers about the effect of adding that transition, because we didn't take that decision lightly either. You know, again, with a child that transitioned from Taylor Prairie into this school, trying to figure out, is adding one more transition difficult? And it was the consensus of the administrators, the educators, and the parents that we talked with that that was okay, that as long as those transitions are well managed, they overcome the problems that come up with equity in the other school. Now, I did mention there is one additional consideration. What I just shared with you was our primary recommendation. So after I just talked all about that idea about why we prefer transition over neighborhood, I am going to throw one neighborhood opportunity up there. The difference between this neighborhood opportunity versus the transition is it's not splitting Cottage Grove School and New School as the shared grades. It's splitting Taylor Prairie School and Cottage Grove School. So it's slightly expanding the grades that would go to both of these facilities and making those have neighborhood boundaries. So there, you're not running quite into the equity issue, because even though Cottage Grove School is older than Taylor Prairie, they're obviously much more equitable facilities than, say, a brand new elementary school. We still think you run into the issue of drawing attendance boundaries. We think it introduces undue stress to the board, which would have to be dealing with that and calls all the time. It does offer one fewer transition, though, and this is, again, something that we want to hear from the community, your feelings on neighborhood schools versus transition schools. And so this is something that you will see when you get the community survey. So this is what this is talking about. I got all my points on there. Again, the first option I shared with you is our preliminary recommendation. This is a consideration that we're passing to the community and the board for their consideration. So what about that new school? So the district does own a piece of property, which, let's see, the bottom right-hand corner of this diagram is where Glacial Drumlin is. The new plot of land is adjacent kitty corner, the upper right-hand corner off of Bus Road. So that is where the new plot of property is. Our recommendation is that we do build on this lot that is adjacent to Glacial Drumlin. A little bit about that piece of property, it's about 40 acres, and the purchase has been approved last October at the annual meeting for the school board. Now again, because this is all very preliminary, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about specifics. We have identified a couple of buckets, again, very, very preliminary, because we want to make sure that the community is going to support us in building a school before we start designing a school. So a couple of facts about that. It is located on district-owned land, so we don't have to worry about the where to put it question. We're tentatively sketching out 10 sections per grade level based on what we believe the enrollment numbers suggest we would need. And again, that's third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, so that would be 30 educational sections. The capacity would be 700 students. And the current orange block up there is about 126,500 square feet. Again, we have not gone through any kind of design. It's just if we needed a building to accommodate 30 units of classroom plus shared services like IMCs and gymnasiums, how big would that be? And then we worked with our partners and they said, per square foot, this is about how much it costs. And so a little bit later tonight, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. Again, it's very preliminary. So I know last week in Monona, we had some very specific questions about things in the building. We're not gonna address that till we decide that we're gonna build a building. So with that, I am going to push it over to Joe to talk about some of our additional considerations.
Thank you, Pat. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Joeyama Miller, and I have been a resident of Monona for over 45 years. I have served on a variety of school board committees, from closings, expansion, new building sites, and been very aware of it. And now as a senior in our community, I think I can express some of the issues and the concerns that older population, which is greater in Monona, also consider and think it. But one of the things I do think I want to be clear about is, Dan talked about it, because of the way the makeup of the committee, that it was evenly split between Cottage Grove and Monona Grove, is that we had really good discussions. And one of the things that I was really proud to be a part of was that when it came to the consideration of how and where a new school should be, and it was very clear to all the members that the facility needed to be in Cottage Grove because that is where the capacity was. I would say that the majority of Monona Grove members on that board always said, let the Cottage Grove people tell us what they want and what they need. This is their community while we're together. And I think that's really important because over in the past years, the split and the divisiveness between two communities and who's leading the bandwagon on what's being happened. Like I said, I didn't see that happen in the FAC, and I was really proud of the work that our administrators, our superintendent, and our consultants led us through the process of how to deal with some of those things. One of the things that also came up was Maywood. Why are we not finding a way to utilize the current buildings that we currently have, which would be Maywood and Nichols? And one of the things that we have to realize is we came to the consensus of as a committee is that it's not a viable option in addressing the needs that we're looking at now. There's limited capacity at Maywood. Right now, about 300 students. It's insufficient to meet that projected number because the students are not going to be over capacity in Monona. It's Cottage Grove. And as Patty said, there's always been a consensus that we're not going to bus our elementary students between our two communities. There are higher operating costs. Opening Maywood as a district school is a two-school solution. It means doubling the operating costs and operating tax impact. And we were very serious in looking at those considerations because they impact each and every family in our school district. There was also higher remodeling costs. Options that involved Maywood were the most expensive, particularly if we looked at bringing all the students of Monona to study here in Monona and take them out of Glacial Drummond. It would be very, very difficult to really have a middle school that would serve those students as well as what they're getting right now. We also, we wanted to make sure that all of these questions that people continue to bring up to us were going to be addressed. And we had to really continue to recognize that enrollment projections is in Cottage Grove. And while we have extra buildings, and we're not at a point we're going to sell those buildings or do it, they're still on the table as keeping as part of our district. We just are not going to use those buildings of Maywood and then now of Nichols to address that additional capacity need. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Nichols ever since the renovations occurred for the district office, but also the fact that it is now the part of MG21. But if you haven't, I would encourage you to see it, because with the changes for the district to be able to address curricular needs, educational needs as a district office, they now do have the space that they can address those things and have the community come in, have conferences, and be able to really deal with that without having to overcrowd the individual schools that they used to meet in order to solve some of those problems. Right now, MG21 is a charter school, and it has about 45 students, and it is expanding. There's the director of MG21 is very creative and innovative. She really wants to be able to provide this as an option to as many school students in our district as possible. So we have to keep that in mind as we look at what is the capacity for Nichols School as well. We also taught that it is right now, Nichols School has inadequate capacity for the multi-grade additional grade levels that would have to be brought in if we use that as an educational setting. We also looked at the high school. While it's under capacity, we know by the previous chart that 10 years down the line that we're going to have to make some changes. And so we looked at that, and we began to look at how we could adjust for those things when we asked the consultants to give us light renovation, heavy renovation. And I will tell you, having worked and been part of both Taylor Prairie and also part of Glacial Drummond, this committee and our school board right now is really looking into the future. And I also had to tell you as a member, one of the things I was most concerned was if we ever had to go to referendum, was our school district and our school board asking it to be done the proper way? And so I went and looked at all the other school districts in our conference, DeForest, Oregon, Sun Prairie, Verona, Wanakee, who passed successful referendums in 2014, 2015, or 2016. And we are on the right path. And one of the key elements that I discovered in talking to other members who served on those committees was what the district is asking now, the community survey. If you put your ideas forth, your considerations of what will become will be looked at by the advisory committee, and then we would be able to take your concepts, your concerns, and meld it with what we've been given to look at. But if we don't have that community survey really filled out by all of us, you're asking that a smaller number of people to make those decisions. And we also recognize that whatever decision is made, there will always be criticism. So I encourage you to take the next phase that we're asking. The most important thing that came out after the last meeting was, what if we do nothing? What are the consequences of doing nothing? Well, let me tell you, they're grave and they're big. We are going to be at overcapacity in 3 of the 5 buildings. We say in the next 5 years, but it could be sooner. We will know that if you have overcapacity at any school or with any classroom, it's a strain on students and staff because of the overcrowding. We also know that students will probably get through, but we really don't know what the net effect is down the line because of this overcapacity. As Dan talked about earlier, we have defrayed big maintenance costs over very many years. At this point, some of our buildings, if we don't do it, the deterioration of them will be could be the point of no return. We also know that increases in construction and finance costs never go down. We're not going to be the lucky winners of a tax break in our school district, no matter how much we may wish it. So we have to think about that. And we already have deferred from 14 million to 16 million. If we defer again, it will only go up, but other bigger things may occur. So we have been really conscientious in our advisory committee as to saying that these capital costs must be addressed as part of whatever the plan is going forth. Even, I think, in maybe at greater risk of some of those renovations. One of the things that came up is to say, why renovate at all? Why make any changes to any of the school? Because they're needed. But it's also an equity issue. You know, the schools in Monona are older than those in Cottage Grove. Their learning style has changed and are different. This is an opportunity that we can give equity to all of our students, all of our buildings, and all of our teachers to be able to teach in the best learning environment. So the next phase will go on to what these costs and this tax impacts will be, and I'll hand it over to Gerald.
Thanks, Joe. My name is Jared Rosing. I'm the Director of Business Services with the school district, and I always get the lucky privilege of sort of sometimes taking the big bubble and popping it. No, I do want to say that the reason that we're here tonight is to talk through the process and to give preliminary numbers and to make sure everybody's aware that these are numbers that we have identified as of today. We wanted to make sure everything was on the list. We wanted to be able to plan long-term at the same time of looking short-term. But ultimately, the reason that we're here is for our students. Whenever we go through the process of building our budget on an annual basis, we always ask the questions, what do our students need? And ultimately, as we look at enrollment, and it's great to see a school district continuing to grow, there are many school districts across the states that are not seeing that, and they're challenged, and they're trying to continue to keep their doors open, continuing to offer the great opportunities that we are able and fortunate to offer. So this first slide, obviously it's very hard for you to read, but there is a handout that has the two templates of how the student would go through the district, but then it breaks down the cost. The first part that I want to talk about is, like I said at the start of my presentation, is that these are numbers that we looked at based on the recommendation. These are not final numbers. We will go through a survey to find out what are the priority of our community, what's the priority of our committees and our Board of Education. So what I'm going to do is walk through the different portions of the different funding. Since we've talked about the process, this is your first opportunity to see what the costs look like. So ultimately, if we were to say today we were going to get everything done that we talked about tonight, from building a new school to taking care of capital maintenance to all the renovations and all of our athletic needs, we'd be looking at $82 to $88 million. But breaking that down to each of those separate needs that we've identified. So if we look at the top, to build a new school, grades 3 through 5, based on 126,000 square feet, we're looking at $33 million to $37 million. That as a community, as a Board of Education, might be the only thing that we ultimately decide to do as step one. But that is one of the areas that when we look at doing capacity, the need that has surfaced to the top. Then when we look through renovations, and we've broken this out by building because there are different costs and different needs by building. And this is really when we talk about, as a homeowner, we go in and we analyze, do we need to upgrade our kitchen? Do we need to upgrade some living spaces? Do we need to convert bedrooms because we have students? These numbers here and these needs are being driven by the needs of our students based on what's changing, what opportunities we want to offer our students, so when they leave the Monona Grove School District, they have the ability to compete globally. And if we looked at doing all those, we'd be looking at $18 million to $20 million. Then moving down to the capital maintenance, here this is a little bit more specific because if you see over there, there's a 2-inch binder. We've walked through our district, we've identified things, and when we did the 2016 operational referendum, we explained, and as committee members have explained, $14 million. Well, over the time, that has went to $16 million, and the reason that's went to 16 is not only because costs have increased, but when we walk through that $14 million were urgent needs in 2016. Now we also have identified urgent needs that were originally part of needs that were 2 to 5 years out at the time of that study. Now those things have moved up. So during the operational referendum, asked for $500,000 extra as part of that 2.6. That money has went into the budget to be able to take some of those other items off. Otherwise, we would be well over $16 million. And then we've broken it down to, if we looked at the outdoor athletic complexes, to bring things together, to centralize our athletic complexes, we're looking at $13 million to just shy of $15 million. So when you add up all four of those sections, that's where we're coming up with the $82 to $88 million. Like I said, that doesn't mean that that's what we're going for. That's not what we're asking. We're doing this as part of the surveying to survey the community. Now, when we look at the costs, obviously, unfortunately, we can't absorb all this within our district operating budgets. So part of that is as Superintendent Olson stated, there are two different types of referendum. We're all very familiar with our recent referendum, which was the operational referendum, and that was what's funded our basic school functions, from being able to take care of some capital maintenance projects, to being able to buy additional technology, to be able to hire additional teachers to keep our class size in the range that we've asked for. We'll be looking at scenario number one. Scenario number one is actually just very similar to your mortgage at home. In order for us to build a building or to go in and do construction in our buildings, we have to go out and borrow money. So what this is doing is this is saying that if we were to borrow the 82 to 88 million dollars, because everything on that list or the slide before is capital, we would go out and borrow that, fund that over 20 years, and get all those projects done immediately. We have to also make some assumptions along the way. Since we're not at that point that we've went to a referendum, we know what the exact dollar amount is. We're looking at that 82 to 88 million dollars, but we also have to make the assumption of what does the interest rate look like. What we do know is what our current debt schedule or our mortgage schedule looks like. So we can work with PMA Financial and predict, well, if we go to referendum in this year, and this is what the interest rate is, we can overlay that. So if we have high years where we have high repayments, we can defer that to sort of level off what our tax rate would look like. So what we're looking at is 0.78 to 0.91, or 78 cents per night, or 91 cents per $1,000 of fair market value. So for a quick scenario, we put up the $100,000 property. That will show you that if your property was $100,000, you'd be looking at $78 to $91 annually. And that would be for a fixed period of time. So if we went to a 20-year financing, it would be a 20-year mill rate. And when we say this, we're also looking at the highest. This is not meaning that this is going to be what it looks like on an annual basis for the next 20 years. The reason that is because of the way that the state budget operates. The state budget is a 2-year cycle, so we also have to predict how much equalization aid that we're going to get from the state government. In addition to that, what's our property values going to look like? And when we talk about property values, obviously it's great to see homes being built in our communities, but commercial property really, really helps us when it comes time to paying for school taxes because they pick up a portion of that. So we're trying to work with each of the municipalities to identify what TID or TIF districts they potentially are going to create. How are we going to be able to attract additional commercial property? Then we have two other examples, 200 and 400,000. But for yourself, if you just take your fair market value, divide it by 1,000, and multiply that dollar amount by either 78 cents to 91 cents, that would give you an idea of what we're anticipating being the highest point of a referendum if we were to go today. The second scenario is obviously very similar to our operating of referendum. So this would be something that would be ongoing. And we say that because when we open a new school, there are certain things that we don't have the money for up front. When we talk about school finance, finance for schools are strictly driven by student enrollment, specifically residents. And when new residents move in, it takes us 3 years to fully get the money from the state or our property taxes for each of those new residents. So when we open a new school, we're going to take, say, 700 students out of different. Those teachers will be funded that way, but there are costs that are not going to be funded up front. Those costs would be utilities, obviously educational supplies, administration. We talk about support staff, so we talk about having paraprofessionals, recess supervision, clerical, we need a school nurse, we need buildings and grounds. So that $800,000 to $930,000 is what we're anticipating the needs for that to be. That cost is well below what the real cost looks like, because what we have to do is project, okay, if we're going to have that many students, we're obviously going to get that additional revenue as well, but it's going to take a number of years to get that. And so this is what we're doing is we're betting this in to our base financing so that we have this to continue to operate the school. Same concept as the debts, other than this would be ongoing. We're anticipating based on the highest points, not the highest point and then the lowest point. We're looking at the highest point. You take your fair market value divided by 1,000, and here you can apply the 0.42 to 0.46, or 42 cents to 46 cents per $1,000 of property value you have. Now, just to put that in reference, is if we were to go, we would potentially ask for these two questions. They would be two separate questions. And in reference to our 2016 operational referendum, that was $1.37 per $1,000 of property. And so this does, when you combine those two, does come in lower than that if we decided to go today for the entire $82 to $88 million. All right, and then we'll move on to next steps with Superintendent Olson.
Okay, so received a lot of information. Again, that information, our committee spent 7 meetings going through. Our school board has been working on for years. And so what we need to communicate out to the community, for the folks that aren't here tonight, we want to engage and really get this information out so we can have our community make informed decisions. Again, the input that we get tonight are going to help us formulate additional information that we need to feed out and so on. So with that, we are going to do, as was mentioned a couple times already, a community survey. Now, the community survey is something that will be mailed to every household, and part of that survey will also be information. We'll try to condense all the information that was provided here into background in that written survey before, so people that haven't had an opportunity to be engaged like this at least have information that they can study before answering the survey. So the real purposes of this, we certainly want to gather that broad community feedback. We want to make sure we have a public voice as the decision-making part goes forward. The communication, as I mentioned, is essential, and then to independently collect what we know will be credible data in their decision-making process. Okay, this is the same one that was shown earlier, but just want to reiterate where we're at in the planning process. Okay, so right now we're in between February and March where we're doing that development of the community survey. And then moving forward, when we get the results back in May, our committee will refine and make a final recommendation. And as I mentioned, when that will go back to the board, end of May, beginning of June, they'll have at least up to 3 months to study that before the board finally puts it together and says, okay, here's our plan that we're going to do moving forward, to talk about what we're going to do as well when we're going to do it. So we have a lot of time yet before that comes. It's essential that we have this engagement, community feedback along the way to drive that decision-making process. Okay, so as we move now into having our questions and feedback. First of all, before we get into the Q&A, I also want to remind everyone that we do have a feedback form that I believe hopefully was already picked up at the table, or we're going to hand it out yet. Okay, so if you didn't pick one up, they're on the table. Before you leave tonight, please fill out that feedback form for us. And we would like to break up the Q&A into 2 parts. The first part right now, where we can take questions and answer in front of the entire group so everyone can hear the responses. As far as the answers, all of us that spoke tonight, the 4 of us can respond, as well as we have our experts from Vandewaal, EUA, and Findorf if there's any specific questions. So we'll take a little bit of time with that, and then after that we'll hang around further for some one-on-one dialogue with any of the folks from the committee as well as our other people that are here with us tonight. So make sure that everyone before they leave tonight has an opportunity to ask their questions. In some of the questions, we may not have answers at this point. The answer might be, yes, that's going to be an additional consideration here as we move through the process. Hopefully we will be able to answer most of the questions that you have this evening. Okay, so with that, like I said, we'll each step up to the microphone and, depending on what the question is, if you have your questions, we are recording this. If you would please go to the microphone in the center between the chairs to ask your question. And just to help us out, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself and as well before you ask your question, and then we'll answer the best we can. Okay, so with that.
Good evening. I'm Ann Bird, Cottage. I'd like to get some idea of the 700 students that you're projecting. Where are they coming from?
Okay. Yeah. So generally, all of the enrollment growth is from Cottage Grove. We need more specifically about new construction, move-ins, and so on. Okay, Mike, would you like to address that?
Hi, I'm Mike Slavny from Vandewaal and Associates, and we map where the students are projected to come from based on residential development projects, first that are currently going on, and then we have another category of those that are getting ready to develop. They're annexing to the village, they're getting the zoning that they need. Prior to that, a step that would maybe put development 5 or more years out, properties are being bought by developers. And then the village has a sewer service area that before property can be given public water and sanitary sewers, the Regional Plan Commission has to include those properties. So we have a list of 10 factors that help predict when development will occur, and the properties that have the most development factors already in place is where we allocate the students first.
So is there any part of the 700 students that's in existing housing?
No, we're looking at new housing as the source of new students. Now, turnover happens in individual houses and individual neighborhoods, and we see that when we live in a neighborhood a long time. But overall, the historic trend going back to 1830 is families have fewer kids in the house. And so our projections do take that into account, but there's really no way we can look at, say, the individual block level or the individual house level, aside from going door to door and seeing how old the residents currently are and guessing when they're going to be too old to live in the house or asking when they intend to move. So our projections don't go into that level of detail.
Okay, thank you. So 700 students, $37 million for a new school because of new subdivisions?
New subdivisions and to a lesser extent, multifamily housing projects, which on a per unit basis generate significantly fewer kids.
Okay, thank you. And I have 2 more questions and then I'll get away from the microphone. How many teachers were formally consulted about the grade level configuration recommendation?
So that went back to preliminary work from 2 years ago in the previous committee. And at that time, we looked at a number of different, configurations. And so our entire administrative team was part of that, and with that, their dialogue with individual teachers. So we didn't have a separate committee of teachers, but we looked at, research and the different, configurations. So at this point, as far as moving forward with this final recommendation, that wasn't generated from a teacher group. But the background information prior to was utilized in sharing. If that answers.
In my review or my research of looking at all the other school districts that went through the referendum, and some chose neighborhood schools, like up in Wanakee, they were building a new middle school and a new, Verona is building a new high school and all these other things. I did call superintendents and PTO people and ask them what their concerns were and what we were being told in looking at the research. And most of them said that while we all have as parents a configuration we think is best for our children, is that the kids can do really well in configurations. There's no set configuration for education for any group, is that making sure that the adjustment and the transition, the teachers work with that, how teachers are supported, really makes the big difference in grade configurations. And so I felt much more comfortable after looking at a variety of school districts to say some had the configurations we did, others had weirder configurations. And like Patty was saying, is one of the things we were hearing is that trying to create neighborhood schools where you had a first, second grader on one side of Cottage Grove go to one school versus another school, that we took more seriously and we looked at. We heard a lot more comments that parents in Cottage Grove would maybe prefer that less among our committee, but that we were open to hear what the community said later.
Okay, last question. What does the research say, as you mentioned that you did research, what does research say about the number of transitions that children go through and the effect on those children Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. There's not conclusive research, but it certainly suggests that transitions is an important factor, and it can have a negative impact. And so that's where it was clear that when you have those, you have to be able to account for it and adjust. But it wasn't overwhelming to say, well, no, transitions are so bad that should not be a consideration, because there are positives with that were mentioned. Having all the great teachers from a certain grade level in the same building certainly is a positive with collaboration and working together. But it is something to need to be very aware of and need to be minimized. So I guess the last thing I'll add to that is, as we move forward and talk about kind of that other consideration, the board has had some preliminary discussions about that. I expect that we'll have many more discussions as well before there's a final recommendation by the board.
I'll just add to that to answer your question too. As the committee, we actually pressed Director of Instruction, as well as Dan, show us the research about what's the best. And to Dan's point, there isn't conclusive that says one model is superior to the other. It supported transition models as long as they were well managed. And what we were able to point to currently is we believe that transitions in Cottage Grove are currently well managed, and that would be something, again, with further feedback from additional teachers. There were teachers and administrators that attended our meetings and provided that feedback. Just to speak to your question about the 700 students, don't forget though that we're pulling the 5th grade Cottage Grove students out of Glacial Drumlin. So it's not 700 new students, it is pulling 7 from 7 5th grade classrooms from Cottage Grove or from Glacial Drumlin.
Mike, did you have something to add?
One thing that I see in smaller communities that have the grade-based transitions like we have now is that if they switch to a neighborhood-based assignment of kids in a community this small with so much new housing coming in, to maintain an equal number of kids at each school, an equal class sizes, those neighborhood attendance boundaries have to change. And you get transitions with that, and perhaps even worse, they're completely unpredictable over, a 3-year period. And that kind of transition affects, and unpredictability affects the planning, the long-range planning for faculty, accounting for likely retirements, and it puts stress on neighborhoods. Are we the next block to get transitioned into the other school? And so there's some other advantages to basing things on the entire community in a set of schools that I think districts don't realize until they've made the transition to the neighborhood-based approach. You still get transitions, they're just not as predictable.
And one of the other things I discovered in looking at other school districts is when they use the applied population and Vanderwall and other consultants who pinpointed development in one area, things can change, your economics can change, where some school districts were looking at a referendum in the midst or at the end of the recession, and where they were told building would come, it didn't come by the time the referendum comes, because by the time a referendum is passed and a school is built, you have years, okay? And even though you plan out or a city plans out, it may not turn out to be exactly that way that you would have for, because I questioned that. I looked at all the little dots where they said the houses were coming, what kind of housing, and I said, well, how do we know and how do we look at that? So I went back to those school districts and asked, because they voted the referendum in 2014. 2018, are you getting the kids from those neighborhoods that your consultant told us? And they said, well, not in the same numbers. And they said, part of it is because of the recession. We didn't get the building we thought, but we're beginning to see it change. We're beginning to see that these projections are getting closer to what we wanted when we went up. And so I think my job as one of the members is to really look and question these projections. You know, I want to be sure, because I don't want us to see what happened when we built Taylor Prairie or Glacial Drummond. We had problems. We had overcapacity the day we opened their doors. And we had, you know, we don't want to switch neighborhoods, because I'll tell you up in Wanakee, they've done neighborhoods, and the teachers and others are saying the changes have caused a lot of stress. And so I think asking those questions and knowing, for me, that even if it's only one community member that has a concern similar to mine, I can keep asking. So ask the questions, because we want to know, as your representative from the community, what to ask these consultants. We don't know any more than you do when we went into this meeting. Also ask your city government where they want to give all the permits. You know, is it the way you want your community to grow? Because that's what I'm doing in Monona. I'm not so sure that all the tips that we're giving out is where it should be, you know?
Thank you. Other questions?
My name is Jim Raymond. We have 3 girls that went through the district. I've coached here for over 34 years at some level. The other day, some coach asked me, what kid do you have all first for? And I said, I'm on my grandkids already. So, and I don't know how long I live in the community. I have to have my wife, because we've been married since we've been in the district. My concerns are mainly with the high school. If that was looked at to maybe build a new high school, or, and as far as you said, to me it's Monona Grove District. I don't care if it's Cottage or Monona. I don't go either way. It's not a big deal to me. I think it's petty to pick on that stuff now. Those days are over. If that was looked at, as far as the facilities at the high school, that's not solving any problems, because currently, now in the spring sports, we're at probably 8 different fields. And I do freshman girls, so they make the rounds. I don't get those girls until 45 minutes later. And just by doing 2 fields at the high school, or a track is going to be, there's no room. And you're only going to solve the football and the soccer crowd and the tennis. And that doesn't include softball or baseball or any other sports. As a taxpayer, I'd rather see you buy another 40 acres and build a facility where we don't have to have 10 concession stands. We don't have to bus to 30 different places. And like you said, Wanakee, first of all, they have a very good industrial tax base. And their football field was all donated. Verona is another case where they got everything. I mean, they basically are building that high school for them. And we don't have that industry, so I get all that, but I think to put that stuff together in little pieces, you're gonna spend how much on a track? And I get that, they need one. I know that they need a football field, I know that, but spend that kind of money in that area, I don't think it's gonna do much for us. We're still gonna be right where we were. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And one thing that I don't think I did a very good job of explaining when I talked about athletics, I did emphasize the upgrades to the existing facilities at the high school. I think what I failed to do is talk more specifically about all those other fields that you mentioned. So we talked about that need. Ideally, we'd like to have all of our softball, baseball, soccer on a central location, which we don't have space at the high school. That 40-acre parcel that we have, we could fit the majority of those fields on that 40 acres along with the school. And so that's something I should have pointed out. We, again, would need to prioritize, but we could if we decided to, and that cost that was developed, that was if we were to develop new fields for all those things, to bring all those sites online at school facilities. So, so that your point is well taken. That was part of the thought process of purchasing the 40 acres, is to not only have space for the school, but also for some additional athletic facilities.
Existing expansion for the high school, I saw that.
Okay.
So where, if you're going to expand there, where would that
Yep, great question. So right now, as you know, the academic wing is actually stories, and so there is space right on the back end of the building that we could do an addition 3 stories up to easily add a number of classrooms to increase capacity. I think, I don't know if we have a number of 200 to 300 we could increase by. Does that sound right?
Yeah, about 225.
About 225. So this plan, you know, was based on trying to be long-term for about the next 20 years. We mentioned it about 10 years out where we think we're going to have the capacities at the high school. If we did an addition at that point, that would get us online to match up with here.
So there, the biggest issue when I come after work is traffic. It's
Yeah.
unsafe. So you got another 200 some kids there. I get that. Where are you going to park them? It's already unsafe. They can't get in and out of there. So you're so limited on space
Yeah.
in an area that, and I'm, like I said, I don't care where it goes, what you do.
Yeah.
It
No,
needs to work.
really good point. Go ahead.
The other thing, which was a surprise or something I learned, was at our current state of our athletic facilities, Monona Grove cannot host any regional or district conference play because it's inadequate for locker rooms and facilities and boosters or whatever. And so one of the things that when the athletic director came in is by upgrading some of these facilities and having more facilities, we now could create an equitable place and having even a stream of revenue come in because we do have the ability to become host to these greater areas. When my children went to school, we did have those, a lot more than what we have here now, because our student population was smaller. We had, you know, my kids were in high school, the track was state of the art. It was real brand new and building. Everybody was coming for the MG invite and talking about that track. Well, not so much now. So we're aware of that, but we need to know, would the community rather put in that 16 million in athletic fields, or classrooms, or maintenance, you know?
I just want to add to that athletics number. I think when we're talking about athletics, it's really easy to think about athletics in terms of the high school, but what that ability of building on this new site does give us, again, as a parent of young children, I am driving them all over communities, and so it gives us an opportunity to have you talk about, you know, driving all over to pick up your kids. So it's not just varsity athletics that would be addressing, it's for kids of all ages in our district. So I think it's really easy to think varsity in your mind, but keep in mind it's for kids of all ages that will be able to use those facilities.
Hi, Jill Lynch, Cottage Girl. I had a couple of questions just kind of resulting around the considerations for the new school. And I just was curious if, you know, consideration been placed or, you know, thought had been around people having multiple children and the timing schools get out, you know, picking up, dropping off, and as well as siblings ever being in the same school. I know it's not for everyone, but there are some siblings who really depend on making a smooth transition by having an older sibling there as someone who's kind of a leader in their first years.
So we looked at that, the additional consideration that Jackie talked about, that Taylor Perry and Cottage Grove, instead of being just straight 4K to K, is that you make it 4K to 2, because we know that those other first graders, second graders really take care of their little baby brothers and sisters. And we also heard from family and parents and teachers, is 4K and K a strong academic influence, you know, to really say we're getting into the educational purposes, is it just an extension of the preschool program? So we did look at that, and as well as for PTO groups. You know, it's a smaller group at 4K, but now you're a PTO at 4K, you're 1, 2, you're 3, 5, and, you know, how many places can you be at one time supporting your kids? So yes, we did look at that, and I think it was a strong feeling that we don't want to throw anything out if we can create, a stronger bond or an education configuration that serves everybody.
And I know bridging is always, in the best interest of the kids, and I really believe in that as kids make, the next transition to the next school. And for the average child, where we look at the population of kids that come through each grade, we look at where the average child, high achiever, and then, low achiever, as to how easy those transitions are. And for some kids, I just think thinking about other communities within, our boundary lines, that 5 transitions just seems like a lot. And I know, like the city talked about that there's a lot of considerations taken into place, and there was a lot of thought around it. But I think that's just a big concern of mine and other neighbors and family that we have in Cottage was the number of transitions and how to keep it smooth and really make sure that we're not putting extra stress on the kids. And if there is extra stress on the teachers, that's just kind of part of what comes along now with the teaching job and being able to, manage that when we're taking it off the kids.
Those are excellent points, and I absolutely am certain that we're going to be having that dialogue here these next several months. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Flynn, and I'm actually a resident. My husband and I just purchased a home this last summer into the fall, and we actually live on the rural end. And so this is kind of interesting to see where these, is there going to be any boundary changes if we went towards a neighborhood school, that it ends up being the way we go, K-4K to grade 2. Would you have to change your boundaries to accommodate some of us rural people, or is that going to be stagnant for over the next 20 years? Thank you.
Great question. So actual school district boundaries never change. I shouldn't say never. It's a very difficult process for them to change, and both school boards would have to agree to that. So for instance, we do neighbor, the Madison School District, of course, is between Monona and town of Cottage Grove. In order to change, both boards would have to agree to kind of a swap or a land. So the short answer is no, those boundaries won't change.
Hi, my name is Mark Hazen. I'm from Cottage Grove. And while you have this slide up, I guess just from crunching some numbers, by pulling an entire grade level out for the parade and 2 grade levels out of Cottage Grove schools, I realize that they're going to be projected to capacity soon, but that seems like it's going to be both of those facilities quite a ways under capacity for quite a long time. I know you got to project out for quite a ways, but if I personally prefer having the 4K and K parade and transitioning to 1 and 2, but it makes it a lot harder to manage those capacities when you try to force grade levels into a certain school, as opposed to the additional consideration here where you have some more flexibility because you can manage it with the boundaries. But I don't know why you're not considering 4K to 3 into those facilities, because you're still quite a ways under capacity there. And it would, in a new school, under this proposal, would only need to be then 4 and 5. And you could always build it with potential to expand or for more capacity, so if you needed to slide the 3rd graders up there later, but it doesn't seem like it now. Right now, with the numbers, both of those schools are going to have a lot of extra room. Then, my main, thought is none of this addresses the capacity at the high school. And so it's a big elephant in the room. It's projected to be over capacity. It's going to, all this growth is going to slide up there eventually. And our high school is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And in my opinion, that equates to fewer and fewer opportunities for kids. And you've got a school of 800 kids, and there's 50 participating in basketball, that's like a 7% participation rate. And when you get enormously, and you've still got the same number of teams, that equates to only like 3% participation rate. So, I guess, rather than building a new grade school, has there been any consideration to building a new high school? It immediately provides twice as many opportunities for band, school play, football teams across the board. And at the road we're going on, 10 years from now, our school is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're going to turn into, you know, the Wanakees and Northern and so where it's just a bigger school and fewer opportunities percentage-wise per kid. Just, if you built a new high school, you could pull, obviously from this slide, the grade students would stay in Winnequa. 6 through 8, when you pull the Cottage kids out of Monona High School, the 6 through 8 could fit into that school. And since there's no growth basically in the Monona area, those schools would never reach capacity, but they would stay exactly at the level, pretty much, that they are currently forever. And the Cottage Grove High School would then, you could put your middle school there if you needed to, but if the Monona kids then went to fit into the Monona Grove High School and went to middle school there, your 4th and 5th graders would now fit into the Glacial Drummond. So I'm just wondering if that's, if that entire scenario has been addressed or been looked at.
We did. We looked at the scenario that said all Monona students would stay in Monona all the way through middle school. We're pretty with them. So we looked at the option of do we convert Maywood. It was too small.
I'm talking about converting the high school.
Eliminating
We did not look at the high school because the high school capacity doesn't hit us for 10 years. And as what we had learned is that right now, capacity is there because we've allowed a lot of open enrollment. We go to residents only, and it gets to the point where we're reaching capacity. Dan mentioned we do have that one card that we can then make a big change to expand out a little bit further. We've discussed for many years in our community 2 high schools. The tax bases don't support the ability to run 2 high schools. Now, if we have a larger high school, maybe we do have to ask the board to make some changes of how students have participation in co-curriculars, all those other things. But it really didn't solve our capacity problem in the needed terms, which is with elementary capacity.
But it does, because when you pull the Cottage Grove high school kids out of Monona Grove High School, your 6th, 7th, and 8th grade can now fit in there as a middle school. That provides capacity almost, 290 students that you're pulling out in Glacial Drummond. So now your 3rd and 4th, or your 4th graders for sure, from Cottage Grove will fit into that facility, and you're no longer at capacity there.
I think what the committee here looking at where we felt it was appropriate groupings of students, and so we would be very uncomfortable based on the conversations that we had had to date, putting a 6th grader and a 12th grader in the same building. We're uncomfortable putting a 5th grader in the same building with an 8th grader just because of the level of exposure. So for the current project and trying to solve the capacity of the elementary, we weren't comfortable with those age groupings that you're suggesting. A, it's not a traditional model unless it's really small districts, and B, you're getting a 6th grader exposed to a 12th grader. I think a lot of us in the committee were uncomfortable with those age groupings.
It is done a lot smarter in districts, and you have to have separations within the buildings for those two groups. But I just wanted to consider it all because, and going back to the initial point is that it just looks like if you pull both third and fourth grade out of Cottage Grove School, both of those grade schools are quite a ways under capacity. It just seems to me that you only have to pull the fourth graders out. That's 160 students, I believe, per grade level. And that immediately provides a capacity for, I don't know, I can't see projections on in here, but because I'm old and I can't see, but for quite a long time.
So thank you for your question, and I think it's a very complex issue, and I'd be glad to have a longer conversation with you afterwards. But the short answer to a couple of your questions, first of all, to be clear, the committee really focused on K-5 solutions. That's where the overcrowding and the capacity issues occur, K-5 and Cottage Grove. And so if fifth grade is out of Glacial Drumlin, we're good in Glacial Drumlin for the next 20 years as a 6-8 building. High school, we're good for 10 years. There would likely need to be an addition at that time, as you pointed out. But I think you misspoke. If we, in either of these, we're actually only removing one grade level from Cottage Grove School, not two. So currently, Cottage Grove School is grades 2, 3, 4. So this scenario would eliminate one grade level. And you're right, it's about 150 to 160 students per grade right now. And so immediately when that happened, yeah, there would be quite a bit of extra space initially. And the projection is that that extra space would last us for about the next 20 years. So that was the thought behind it. The short answer as far as the two high schools, this committee did not investigate that. My understanding is that the district looked at that very closely about 10 years ago when Glacial Drumlin was built. The one major issue besides the cost with having two high schools is if you had a high school in Monona only for Monona students, it would only be a high school of 300 to 350 students. You would have that as far as educational opportunities. There's no way it would be equitable to a larger size. So that also would be a key consideration. But again, it's a much more complex answer than that. We'll be glad to talk more in depth.
Just to go back to the grade school, what I meant was it would only be 2 grade levels if you use the alternate recommendation, and then you are combined between the two schools. It'd be about 320 students that you're moving, as opposed to only 160.
That's accurate. So under this scenario, if you made both Taylor Prairie and Cottage Grove 4K through 3, that would provide relief. You could make that new school just a 4-5, and what that would mean is it just wouldn't solve the issue for as many years. It'd be more of a short-term solution. And again, this is a little bit more of a complex, discussion, but educationally, we did also kind of look at where the natural breaks are, curriculum-wise. Between 2nd and 3rd grade, we do a lot of things K2 and 3-5 curriculum-wise. Not that you can't have a break elsewhere, we do right now, but that would be the ideal break. And then, of course, between 5th and 6th grade is the other ideal break. But please.
Aaron Blum, Cottage Grove. I teach at Madison West High School, so I'm very familiar with schools that are over capacity. One of my fears is that maybe we aren't projecting enough growth. When we mentioned Glacial Drumlin, stores open, they are already at capacity. We also have alternate factors coming in, like Summit coming in and possibly creating expansion or growth in the community with their influence. Are we doing enough to project for the future right now? And is this leaving us enough room in case these projections are slightly off?
That's a great question. One thing that we're seeing that we feel will counteract Summit is that there's a shortage of actual developers working in the village right now. A lot of developers in Wisconsin went extinct during the last recession. It was a housing-based recession. And so that has counteracted some of the economic development initiatives. But frankly, the best way to keep projections on track is to monitor enrollment every year and see how the projections are doing. And when you begin to get departures from the projections, which are bound to get less accurate over time. It's time to redo the projections. And by doing a gut check on a regular basis, I think that's the best mechanism for ensuring you don't go too far down the wrong path.